Anyways, like you said, Ron Weeb. I'm with the Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Branch, and I just wanted to bring some highlights as to who we are and what we are. Basically, how we see ourselves and what we basically are involved in. So, Trevor and I are underneath, and actually that's my boss, so he's here to answer all the tough questions. But Justice and Solicitor General is who we work for. You can see as you break it down and stuff, we have the Minister of Justice, breaks over to the Deputy Minister of Justice, and all the way down through the process where you find our different branches in the Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Branch is tagged in there with the Public Safety Division on this side. We roughly have 112 field officers, 38 enforcement officers, which are senior officers in operations, such as myself as well. Special Investigations Section and a Forensics Unit Section, 57 districts in the province, in the 4 regions. And we usually have 1 to 4 officers per district. Fish and wildlife officers in the community do a variety of things, everything from public lands to fisheries checks to trapline checks on skidoos in the wintertime. The Government of Alberta's goals are to protect, preserve, and manage Alberta's fish and wildlife and to protect the lives and property of Albertans. To help meet these goals, Alberta's fish and wildlife officers ensure Albertans understand and follow legislation that protects fish and wildlife through education, prevention, and enforcement. We also administer programs and operations for human and wildlife conflict management, and we provide support for public safety programs. The fish and wildlife officers have the authority to enforce a number of provincial and federal regulations, and that's where I try to tie in some of the fisheries discussion. You'll see the stuff that's in red is highlighted. That's our fisheries appointments. So we deal with all these different provincial acts and regulations, more than anything the Wildlife and Fisheries Act provincially. That's some of our key pieces of legislation. Federally, we deal with Migratory Birds Conventions Act, a pile of other stuff. The Fisheries Act itself is our key component when it comes to the fisheries portion of the Freshwater Fish Marketing Act and the Alberta Fishery Regulations, which is what we typically charge the majority of our violators underneath. The Fish and Wildlife is responsible for conservation law enforcement in the province. You can see the bottom left of the screen, we do airport checks where we check people coming and going. We work with Canadian Wildlife Services, or Environment Canada now I guess they're called, and we do all kinds of confusing things as you see on the right hand side. That's one of our superintendents there patrolling in a lake boat. We do compliance patrols dealing with a variety of different things, and the guys actually have a great career when you talk about getting outside. We do investigations. We do investigations of public complaints and tips. There's officer-initiated investigations, interviews, interrogations. We, of course, effect arrests. We have human sources. Warrants and authorizations are a key component, and when it gets to that level, Trevor and I are always involved. Evidence collection and analysis is very significant for the guys. Court documents and trials and hearings. So those are our basic components of the investigations. We also deal with problem wildlife. In the province, you can see a bear getting released, cougar eating some stuff, and that's actually the infamous cougar from Calgary over by the hospital a couple years ago. Moose, we catch them in the city and have issues with those as well. The bottom right screen, that's a grizzly bear that's actually in Calgary a couple years ago. Actually, or was that last? Starting to lose my...
That was like 3 or 4 years ago.
Okay. Problem wildlife, public security, and property protection is a key component. You can see there we've handcuffed that bear. None of these animals are dead, by the way. Dangerous wildlife response is something we deal with. Human wildlife conflict investigations, maulings, injuries, and near miss. That's a key thing for us. Compensation programs, predation on livestock, ungulate damage to agricultural products, and bear response team programs. So you can see, if you're wondering some of the bears and issues we deal with, this is right outside our doorstep, only a few minutes away from Calgary here. And this is one of the things we dealt with last fall, one of the issues. So we actually captured all 3 of those bears and moved them to a safer location. But gives you an idea, there's 420 pounds on one, 385 on the other, and 250 on the other one. The pretty one is the lightest one. So anyways, I gotta move past that slide. Predator response teams, I'm a specialist in that program as well. We all have specialties typically in our branch. You'll see that's that smaller bear right there. It looked a lot bigger when it was on the hoof, but you can see Trevor and I in the corner and holding some of the other bears, dealing with some of the stuff, but we end up having to deal with these bears for the safety of themselves as well as our locals. We do the bear releases. See if I can go back on that slide. There's one of our releases here of a good-sized bear that got released. And that's what our guys deal with on a regular basis, and trying to keep the bears safe and us as well when it comes to releasing them. It's quite impressive, actually. When you see tire marks or bite marks on your bumper, you really know you got close. So we were involved in emergency response support, and I guess that could involve some fisheries. There were some fish floating around in 2013. As you can see, this is evacuating High River. Actually, that's me hanging off the edge of the loader. My truck, it's all about me today. And I don't mind that, actually. But you can see we were involved in some public safety issues there. We're deeply invested in the communities and public education. And we do public education for Bear Smart, Wild Smart, educating people in so many different components of that. We also have an operations section, so when you start talking a little bit deeper than just the officers out in the field, we get into professional standards unit, which involves recruitment, training, equipment, uniform, internal investigations. And there's the compliance unit, which is Aboriginal affairs, constitutional file management, policy, directives, standards, judicial orders, and regulations. Pretty significant for us. We're involved in the Western Conservation Law Enforcement Academy, which trains from Manitoba through to the Yukon and BC. You'll see more of that. That is our training program there. Special Investigations and Forensic Services section is a very interesting section. We never know who we're talking to, even for us. Undercover unit, the Major Investigations Intelligence Unit, Forensic Services, which is the Wildlife Forensics Lab. That's our Special Investigations and Forensics Service. The Forensic Unit, we're very proud of. Dr. Rick Jobin in the bottom left there, and Tom Packer on the right-hand side. It's the most requested service that we have is DNA matching, which is very significant. They've created their own profile for all our freshwater fisheries, from walleye all the way through to many of the trout species, so they can key identify them from one side of the province to the other and up and down. Species identification of evidence can occur via DNA sequences, protein analysis, physical examination. Rick was very involved in the Picton murders. He was seconded and left us for several months, wasn't it? Involving a lot of that stuff. So he also connects and links predators to human mauling victims. In this case, that bear actually killed a person. In the undercover unit, Alberta Fish and Wildlife has maintained a capacity to deliver an undercover program for 40 years. The use of undercover techniques to investigate and respond to fish and wildlife is common in most natural resource law enforcement agencies throughout North America and considered an integral part of the overall enforcement program. Our undercover techniques have been proven, and they're very valuable and very recognized. We have a phenomenal inspector in charge of the undercover unit and overseeing a national level team as well. The undercover unit, you can see there's a pile of walleye there and other things harvested. I believe these were galls and bear parts. That's dried meat. That's dried meat. Thanks, Trevor. And the truck that was seized with it and stuff. You see more. So they're constantly on the move and planning. Traffic investigations, and this one involved Operation Roller Coaster, but we've also had some very large operations regarding fisheries. Major Investigations and Intelligence Unit is the purpose of that program is to provide leadership and direction in major cases. Involves specialized enforcement techniques, provincial surveillance teams, interprovincial and international communication and investigations, and human source handling, as well as the reporter-poacher program. There's also intelligence collection and dissemination, which gets to be a very complex thing. Our fisheries and wildlife enforcement, you can see there's a pile of trout that have been harvested there. It is a constant challenge to adapt to changing priorities for fish and wildlife officers. Wildlife, fisheries, public lands, aquatic invasive species place unique and varying demands on our officers. Districts are spread from Fort Vermilion, like we said, to Blairmore with 1 to 4 officers. Most violations are not called into the reporter-poacher line, and less than 3% of the violations are detected provincially. Alberta's diverse and increasing population continues to place new pressures on our officers. In 2017, we had roughly about 2,200 fisheries violations that were detected. We had wildlife is quite a bit lower, just below 500. And then we had a pile of others, which includes your public lands and stuff. It can include monster trucks going through streams. We've seized a number of trucks in the last couple of years dealing with that type of stuff. And ATVs going through streams wrecking reds and the like. Poaching in Alberta involves, on the bottom right-hand side, you'll see a bunch of fisheries stuff. That was about $4,000 worth of fines netted for some illegal fishing activity. This cougar is an ongoing case where it was just shot just several days ago. This is wastage in some migratory birds and an illegally harvested deer that was left. So the Report a Poacher program is very key for us, but you can never get enough people phoning in. Some of our big challenges that are upon us right now are aquatic invasive species program for the province. It's ran through Environment and Parks, and we're heavily involved in the inspections. We deal with that a lot, but you'll see the quagga mussels, Eurasian milfoil, some of the things that are happening right before our own eyes. In the last couple of years, we've watched it develop, and we're going to potentially see our fisheries plug up with invasive species that are causing significant damage. So invasive species in the Bow River, these are Prussian carp. They actually, the biomass, I believe, in last year was 40% of the biomass of fish in the Red Deer River was these Prussian carp, which are absolutely destroying our fisheries. All goes right back to don't let it loose. It's everything from your little fish in the aquarium forward. And these are Prussian carp that are in the Bow River right now. So that's a great big challenge for us. It's a fellow who's actually out fishing and posted this.
Bow River, catching lots of Prussian carp. I've caught 11 so far.
So this guy started killing them. There's no limit on Prussian carp in Alberta. They're an invasive species and we want them gone. We want people to pull them out and kill them. But you can see that these fish are competing with our native species and doing significant damage now. So the Alberta the Aquatic Invasive Species and Fish and Wildlife, our Fish and Wildlife officers are trained to conduct inspections for mussel-fowl boats, stopping vessels at inspection stations as well as tracking down vessels that went by stations is a whole new challenge in the fisheries enforcement world. Protecting Alberta's lakes and rivers from these invasive species is virtually impossible once they've been released into the ecosystem. So we're running into some very significant challenges that we never had several years ago. Whirling disease was another key component that might be worth touching on. We have whirling disease in the province now, as everybody knows. There's a whole life cycle. You guys can search it out, but you can see what it does to these trout, and they end up in mortality in the end, but hopefully we have some survive. There's been some hot spots for the disease. Of course, we first found it in Johnson Lake up in Banff, and it spread throughout the Bow River and through the South Saskatchewan drainage. There's maps online and stuff, but you can see some of the things there. We've had some significant challenges with that. You can look up whirling disease. It is an infectious disease. I can't even say that, Myxobolus cerebralis. It's a protozoan in the class. Anyways, it essentially affects finfish, which are a lot of your salmonids. It's not a risk to humans, but it's significant to the population. Fish and wildlife officers deal with the containment of the whirling disease, transport of fish, and stopping transmission of the disease is a key concern for us. We're facing it on a regular basis, and that's kind of that. So I didn't have a whole lot more as far as getting real specifics and identifying stuff. Our fines, when you start talking about the poaching in our fisheries end of things, even locally in Strathmore, I had an officer picked up a fellow that caught 4 rainbow trout. Our Bow River was recently closed last year. For the first time, there is no keeping of any fish species out of the Bow River aside from Prussian carp. And we ended up netting $9,000 on that individual. I heard earlier on talks about repeat offenders. We have one fellow, we just seized his boat, his gear, everything else. The guy's a repeat offender, and the only way he said that he'll quit poaching, for example, is when he's dead. So we actually have a court order against him. He can't even be in possession of a fishing rod, can't be in a boat, and if he catches a fish, he has to report himself to a Fish and Wildlife officer at a specific location within a time frame. So, poaching is very significant, as we said. From our standpoint, we catch less than 3% of the violators, so it's so big this way, we have no idea exactly what happens on a daily basis. But our fisheries within the province can't sustain the increase in populations, the overharvest, and potentially even the hook mortality in many cases when you talk about catch and release. So our officers are tapped doing, as you can see, a myriad of different things. We can't focus on one specific thing. We're involved in the fisheries aspect all the way up to the habitat. We can be into that too, but then we tend to pass things over to the federal fisheries boys from there. So You have anything else to add on that? I brought Trevor for all the questions so I could sit down and let you ask them. Are we doing questions right now, Phil, or?
Given that we're in good time, I would say let's take some of the questions
Okay.
now, and we have plenty of time for the next part. Since you've combined both parts of this, and we'll open it up for you guys. I'd had one really practical question. That bear release was some poor soul holding that camera.
Well, we do pick the people for that, but
Is that how we introduce your internship program? Yes, I just, by way of introduction, it really struck me, apart from the massive scale of the jurisdictional challenge that you have, and the range of things that I think people tend to forget about in the provincial jurisdiction, it seems pretty clear that a lot of what you're doing overlaps pretty significantly with some areas of federal interest as well, even down to the airport patrols, I noticed. Do you have a regularized sort of protocol or an agreement as to how you divide those? You mentioned for habitat, you turn it over to federal fisheries. For the ones where there's a legitimate overlap, do you just, if you're the ones that catch the particular case, or you're the one that's most involved, or is there a standing arrangement with federal government to avoid conflict in this sort of matter?
And as far as the fisheries?
Well, fisheries, and I mean, to take it as broadly as you like.
With our wildlife, it's provincial legislation, so the only time across the federal threshold is interprovincial movement under WPRETA, the Wild Animal Plant Protection Act. So we do we get involved somewhat with the export between provinces.
Yeah.
And that would be where that would end. The Migratory Bird Convention Act is kind of duplicated somewhat in the Wildlife Act as well. So if it's specific to migratory birds and we're doing migratory bird enforcement, we may choose to, lay charges against folks specifically under Migratory Bird Convention Act, but a lot of times we just stick with our Provincial Wildlife Act to deal with those. So federal fisheries, we do have a protocol. So other than possession, like the way our provincial regulation is written, there's sometimes can be overlap with possession of fish that are taken in contravention of Act and regulation, and that's a Federal Fisheries Act charge. So we may use that one in lieu of having enough evidence to put everything together of how they acquired the unlawful fish. Anything beyond that, we always run it through Federal Crown and use the expertise that the other branches.
Do you have any, and we'll have one almost ready, I'll have one small one. Are there any prosecutors who make this a particular specialty that your department would tend to work with? I mean, you've seen this specialization obviously at the federal level, and I'm wondering whether that's happening provincially.
It's not. We generally go through our local Crown prosecutor's office. In some areas, in the smaller communities, of course, we have really good relationships because they're the only guys that show up at that small location all the time. We get to know one another and we can work through stuff. Some of our larger jurisdictions pose a greater challenge, at the Edmonton, Calgary, because there's always somebody new coming through. And if you don't have a really good understanding of our legislation, some of our issues, it can seem kind of minimal that somebody's kept one fish. But for us, it's a big deal. We actually apprehend such a small percentage of overall violators. So everything is, we want to make sure that we follow through with it, act as a deterrent. However, a lot of our specified penalties for our fines are quite low, which, if there's a significant enough impact on the resource, we'll send for a court appearance and hopefully get a higher court case. As Inspector Weeb mentioned, the case in Strathmore where the guy got like $8,000 for going over limit.
Okay. If somebody,
Thank you for your presentation, Ron. What is the estimated fish mortality and catch and release related to the hooks? And secondly, are the Prussian carps edible?
well, it all depends what you like to eat. I actually don't have the numbers on the mortality on the. Do you have anything on the mortality?
On specific catch and release, the science part of fisheries is looked after by our fisheries biologists, and we kind of leave that in for them to take care of. But I think as long as people are using proper techniques, if they're picking the fish up by the eyes and squeezing them and all that kind of bad stuff, and we're throwing fish, we see lots of that, you know, the mortality can be quite high. If people gently take the hook and it's hooked, you know, just in the lips, it's, I couldn't even put a percentage, but it's probably a low percentage. I think statistically what we understand is, and why you see a lot of times there's bait bans, is the fish tend to hit harder, they take the hook deeper, and that's where we see the increased mortality, just because the hook is farther down into the fish than just a bear hook.
And interestingly, we've gone from barbed hooks in the province to barbless, and now we've gone back and repealed that portion of the legislation and gone again with barbed hooks. So the whole gist of catch and release and success on them is questionable. And there's some effort within the province and some of the, like the North Ram River, I believe it is. They're looking at some of the other areas where they're looking at closing the fisheries, try and maintain the fish species in there, rather than just allowing the catch and release portion of it, which isn't necessarily supporting the population increase and getting back to where it needs to be. So as far as the Prussian carp and the edibility portion, there certainly are people. We check people along, and a perfect example is when I'm working with the guys in the Red Deer River and the Bow River, we're finding people that will keep each and every fish. It doesn't matter what species it is, but there's many people now that aren't purist into walleye or specifically into sauger, pike, or some of the trout species. They're willing to pretty much eat anything and cook anything, and it'd be nice if the Prussian carp could be removed and eliminated, but I don't think you're going to see that, because that 40% of the biomass in the Red Deer River, for example, that's happened within just a few years as far as we're aware, and it's just when the guys are electrofishing and they're pulling up these huge masses of fish, it's so significant to the populations that are native that we're just going to see a major decline. So.
Somebody up here?
Bear 148 that was translocated from Canmore to BC, and the fallout that came from that. Is there any consideration on working between jurisdictions more closely as a result of that?
Yeah, actually, currently we're sitting in a roundtable group, and we have a technical group attached to the roundtable players, which involve national parks, ourselves, Alberta Parks, looking at better ways potentially to work together to solve issues like the Bear 148. At the end of the day, you know, it's really difficult when you have a bear with that travels like that, you know, so used to people. I think everybody could probably assume that when you go to a national park, they understand that they're going to see lots of wildlife, and the park is, you know, for the most part, it's more accepted that people are going to have these interactions with wildlife, and they have to be more aware. Our problem is when they come out of those national parks into places like Canmore, places like Calgary, where we've had a couple now, it's really difficult to find a different way for us to respond. We don't want, like the bear in the slide deck there that's on the table that's had to be put down because it actually killed somebody. We want to avoid that. We want to avoid mortality with people, and we want to avoid mortality with bears. So if we could interject before a bear gets so used to people that it's lost its fear, that's going to put people at risk, and people are getting closer and closer to it. You know, we have some fundamental differences, I guess, on what we're going to do in those situations. But you know, when it comes up, that particular incident, it was just, we felt it was too much of a risk keeping her where she was. We moved her. In all intents and purposes, it probably would have been a successful relocation had she just not stumbled onto some hunters who were lawfully hunting grizzly bears at the time. She seemed quite happy and content in the area that we put her in. So it's just unfortunate it ended the way it did.
I was just wondering if you can provide an idea of the level of fines and also give us a sense if they've changed over time.
Well, probably our biggest investigations, I didn't pull any big fine amounts today, but our biggest investigations often involve the special investigation section. And so through the undercover work that's been done, and some great work, whether it's fisheries violations or whether it's some significant wildlife violations, we had a case within the last couple of years where they've seized the individual's Hummer. I'm trying to remember the total dollar value on the fines.
It's couple $100,000.
Yeah, just over $200,000 in fines for the violations, and so we do get these larger scopes when you start talking about the big investigations. The small stuff on the ground, we're finding where we have a person harvesting, for example, one deer out of season or without a license. We're typically running $1,000 to $2,000. We're pushing more towards the $5,000 mark. But as Superintendent Miller identified, what we have are issues that sort of, we're sitting there with property crimes and people getting abused, and then we try and convince the justice that, yeah, we have a real value in this deer, and he's wondering why, because 3 people just hit him on the way into the courtroom. So that tends to be one of our struggles, is getting the bigger fines. And so usually we're looking upwards of a couple $1,000s for anybody committing any significant offense, upwards to a couple $100,000 if it's our major investigations unit involved in the undercover folks. So does that help?
And some of our specified penalties are quite low. They're, think for a fish, an illegal fish, you're going to pay like $100 fine. Well, most people are burning that much gas in a day plus, right? So, and we're only, catching a small percentage of people, and most people figure that out. The people that are purposely going out and violating the law, they know that their chances of getting apprehended are quite low, and if they do, it's like $100. So it almost diminishes our resource having our fine levels as low as they are. And that's why when we have a significant impact, and we generally back it up with a fisheries biologist, for example, the fisheries stuff, just because it can be so significant in the cumulative effect of unlawful fishing, is trying to get those higher fines and provide that deterrent. And but it's almost lake specific, as you'll have a lot of users use a specific lake and they'll hear about a high fine, and that'll keep people honest for a short time. Eventually things come around and we have the continual problems again. But
we have somebody here first.
Given that your numbers are few and your area is so large, can you maybe comment on ways that the general public might assist you in terms of surveillance or evidence collection to help you do your jobs better?
Well, the first off would be the reporter-poacher program is so significant for us, and people calling in. Getting the basics and not putting themselves in jeopardy is always, as with any reporting, any crime, is very important. So as far as collecting evidence, if people were involved in the opportunity to take a photograph, and I understand, take a photograph of a vehicle with a plate number, that's one of your biggest things. Getting an actual good description, just the same as any other crime, and truly understanding what that is and reporting it in a timely fashion. When we get somebody reporting 2 weeks later for somebody illegally fishing with bait on the Bow River and keeping fish, it's kind of a moot point. We can go back and knock on the door, but he's already ate the evidence by the time we get home. So there's little value in that, but there is significant value in providing some of those key components, and I believe we're moving towards an app that will actually allow people to report violations for us. So it's going to really streamline things when people can get onto an app and they see reporter poacher, start punching in the numbers and push that into a line that will end up getting back to us. It'll get us back on the ground, but again, with, as you said, the limited numbers is a significant thing for us. If we have only 3 officers on in my unit, for example, after a long weekend, because we pretty much push everybody out on the weekends, most of our violations are on the weekend, that's when all the weekend warriors are out. You might find a Monday or Tuesday that's much quieter, and the poachers tend to know that. There's nobody around, so there's a 2-hour response before one of our guys can get to a remote location. Very difficult for us. So to tell you how to solve that, well, we need a lot more people on the ground, but that's probably not going to happen overnight. So
human sources and reporter-poacher reporting is so important and critical for us. We can't do it without the public, just because they're more the eyes and ears. We're high profile with our patrol vehicles, and when we're in an area with the use of everybody has a cell phone nowadays. Like 20 years ago, it wasn't much of an issue. You could sneak into an area and be quite effective and apprehending people. Today, the reality is, as soon as somebody sees us, we're on a chat board or a text group, or the sky's the limit, and everybody knows we're around, and so our detection rate when we're actually doing patrols is quite minimal, versus the people that are going about their outdoor activities and observing things that could that are illegal and sending it in to us. So it's invaluable for us.
One question here, and then we have also, after that, an online one. Yes, right.
Last year, there was a report issued by the department on the number and type of charges for OHV, off-highway vehicle offenses. I'm just wondering if that's going to be repeated this year.
Yes, that's the continued plan, and the priorities in the government have shifted a significant focus onto public lands law enforcement, which includes a lot of the ATV enforcement that's damaging our public land base. And so yes, we are going to continue on with that program and set it as a priority. However, as Inspector Weed noted in the presentation, we have a lot of competing interests. So we do our best, but it's a big area and a few bodies out and about. So again, we rely on people to report violations, so we know where to prioritize our work to. And historically, the report of poacher line has just been for fisheries and wildlife offenses, and they've expanded that to for the public lands law enforcement reporting as well. So.
I have a question for you from online viewer. She's asking, is there funding or management plan being prepared to eradicate this population boom of carp?
That question I couldn't even answer. There's no limit on the harvest of them, and so you can harvest Prussian carp, as we identified, to no limit. Getting the people out there to actually do it would be the next thing. The plans to eliminate, and I can't speak to all the specifics, environment parks and their biologists would be the ones to answer that specifically, but I don't think you're going to be able to limit the biomass that's reproducing in the water bodies in Alberta. So, but that said, if there is a plan, I haven't heard of it yet.
Oh, we have another one.
I got another one. We're coming in. This question, I'm just going to read it. The speaker used the words human source. Can you ask the current panel if people who call in are automatically treated as informants, or do they keep record of their names and details for later disclosure purposes should there be a prosecution someday?
Kind of both. We have some guidelines and policies. So most people that call in, report a poacher complaint, maybe a one-off or two-off. But we do develop over time human sources. We register them and do all the things that we need to do with when we actually start managing an informant. And they've been quite valuable for us in the branch to provide a little bit deeper of some of the issues that we're trying to tackle out in the field. It's more the commercialization. It's managed from our MIU section, and through them they start these larger investigations that usually involve trafficking of wildlife and fish, and have like those significant impacts on our resource.
Anybody else ready? Maybe I'll ask one small one, because the carp seem to keep coming up. How did they get introduced? Is this from aquarium fish, or what was the origin of this?
The origin of Prussian carp. I'm led to believe they're essentially an aquarium fish. A lot of people grow carp in their backyards and the ponds and stuff. And for some reason or another, some people believe they should be releasing and moving fish species from one body of water to another. We have it, like it's so regular in Calgary, and it's crazy. But we even have those little ponds you're driving by on Stony Trail that are in the ditches that are newly made, the stormwater retention ponds and stuff. Those have Prussian carp in them. People feel that they can put a fish in there for some valuable reason. We don't truly understand it, but that's essentially how they're being introduced from one point to another. And there was one overlying slide there that is a perfect example, and it was when I identified Prussian carp in the Bow River, and it's actually from Hannah. They have a reservoir right there on the edge of Hannah, And what you saw is the water levels go down, and all of a sudden all these Prussian carp are out on top of everything. Even that body of water, and we're going, well, how would a Prussian carp make it from wherever they are being released in this area out to there? And of course, it's just the connection that everybody wants to pick up that little fish. They want to put them in a bucket. Maybe they have their kids picking up the little pink bucket and carrying it home, and they go, well, now it's time to get rid of them. Poof, and down they go into the stormwater system and eventually make their way. So sadly enough,
So idiots is what you're...
yeah, you can. Yeah, there's some comments I could help you with, but yeah, you summed that up well. So.
We have anybody else, either online or... Nope, then we'll, I think at that point, then we can thank both Ron and Trevor. This was fascinating for me, certainly, and really appreciate the time you've taken with the questions as well. And we'll move on now to the marine side of things with Dinah. Is your presentation up here? We may need help. Do you know where it is? You got it? Okay, thank you. I knew you'd come if I looked helpless.
There you are. So all you have to do is just do this. Okay. Just move this around. So my name is Dina Teitel. I'm a staff lawyer at EcoJustice, and I'm going to be talking about the Species at Risk Act and using the southern resident killer whales as a case study to illustrate some of the SARA protections that are required for aquatic species and some of the challenges that those species face in receiving those protections. Okay, and just to start off, a note about EcoJustice so that you understand my perspective on this. We're a not-for-profit organization that does public interest environmental litigation, and this includes a history of litigation and, thanks. Okay. Oh, I was going to stand over here. Thanks. And this includes a history of work under the Species at Risk Act to achieve protections for the southern residents. And one of the perks of our job is that sometimes when we go to court, people show up with large cardboard killer whales. And so I'll run through this case study using these 4 examples of sort of stages along the way in protecting southern resident killer whales. And so before I do, I'll just run through a few key provisions of the Species at Risk Act that are relevant here. So the purpose of the Species at Risk Act is to prevent extinction and provide for the recovery of listed species. And as a part of that, one of the things that the minister responsible for a given species has to do is prepare a recovery strategy if the species is extirpated, endangered, or threatened. And that recovery strategy will identify critical habitat and threats to critical habitat, as well as a broad strategy to address the threats to the species, and it states when an action plan will be completed for the species. And so that action plan includes a description of measures proposed to protect critical habitat and to implement the recovery strategy, including when those measures will take place. And once critical habitat is identified, the competent minister has to ensure that it is legally protected from destruction in one of 2 ways that I'll get into in one of my examples. And at that point, it becomes an offense to destroy critical habitat. And finally, listed species and their habitat are protected from the potentially adverse effects of proposed projects or activities that require an approval under another federal piece of legislation. And so before I get into the examples, also an introduction to the southern resident killer whales. This is a distinct type of killer whale. Resident type killer whales are one of the 3 kinds that are found off the west coast of Canada. And this type is the fish-eating type of killer whale. So they eat primarily salmon, and specifically Chinook salmon, because those are the largest, so they get the most nutritional value from them. And the habitat of resident killer whales is determined by where their prey is found. And so the southern resident killer whales are the transboundary population that spends a lot of time sort of between Vancouver, the Gulf Islands, and the San Juan Islands in Washington State. They're a genetically isolated population. They're linguistically distinct, so they have their own specific calls amongst themselves, and they don't interact with other killer whales. So they're a unique type, and their numbers can't be increased from outside the population. Growth can only come from inside the existing population. And these whales are endangered because of their small population size, which just makes their continued existence more precarious. They're more vulnerable to threats or to accidents. And 3 main human-caused threats, which are the lack of prey availability, noise in the marine environment, primarily from vessels, and that interferes with their ability to communicate with each other and to find salmon, which they all do using sound, as well as contamination of the marine environment, which is particularly a problem in the Salish Sea where they live because it's so industrialized. And the current most urgent threat appears to be the lack of prey. Okay. So starting with the first example, as I mentioned, the Species at Risk Act requires a recovery strategy for species, including endangered species, and it has to identify critical habitat and the threats to critical habitat. So the recovery strategy for the southern residents was delayed by 18 months because of disagreement between the experts preparing the recovery strategy and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and to a lesser extent, the Department of National Defense, over whether to include references to acoustic degradation and also the lack of prey availability as threats to critical habitat. So recognizing the importance of not just the geophysical area of critical habitat, but also the attributes that make it critical habitat for the whales, that make it useful for them. And ultimately, those aspects of critical habitat were included in the recovery strategy. And as I mentioned earlier, the Species at Risk Act also requires legal protection of critical habitats. And this is either done through other acts of Parliament, as confirmed in a protection statement that just summarizes what those protections are, or in a protection order, which is a new instrument that applies the Section 58 prohibition on destruction of critical habitat to the areas and components that are identified in that protection order. And this identification and protection, this protection of critical habitat was ultimately only done for the southern residents after environmental groups represented by Eco-Justice took legal action. So the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans initially took the approach of a protection statement, so identifying existing protections under other laws, and that statement relied heavily on the existence of discretionary provisions of the Fisheries Act, and it also only addressed the area of critical habitat as opposed to the attributes of it, like prey availability. So after some eco-justice clients took the minister to court over that, the minister replaced the statement with a protection order, but still limited critical habitat to areas as opposed to attributes. And so ultimately, the litigation ended when the Federal Court of Appeal confirmed the importance of critical habitat and the mandatory nature of Species at Risk Act protections, including for critical habitat. The court held that parliamentary intent was that protection be compulsory and non-discretionary, and the court also found that critical habitat includes both the geographic location of habitat and also those attributes that make it important critical habitat. And so for this species, critical habitat is now protected by a critical habitat protection order that does include all aspects of critical habitat. Although I'll note that the area of critical habitat still hasn't been fully identified, and DFO is still working on designating an additional area of critical habitat as knowledge about the species evolves. And so in my view, this example shows two challenges in aquatic species receiving protections under the Species at Risk Act. One is in the delay that occurred because the federal government was reluctant to fully identify critical habitat. And SARA in general is plagued by delay. And another problem is this reluctance to fully implement the action, the fact that civil society organizations had to take the extreme step of litigation in order to have these protections realized. So, second example, as I mentioned, in addition to a recovery strategy, the minister has to produce an action plan that's meant to implement the recovery strategy. And that has to identify the measures that will be taken to implement the recovery strategy and also when they will be taken. And so the deadline identified in the recovery strategy for the species was March 2013 for an action plan. Ultimately, it wasn't published until March 2017, so another example of delay. And importantly, in my view, this action plan isn't up to the standard required by SARA, and that's one reason for that is that it focuses on research to the exclusion of action. So the document itself says that it's primarily about research action items, and it uses words like investigate, assess, monitor throughout as the items in that plan. It also uses non-committal language, leaving open whether measures will actually be implemented by qualifying measures with, like where appropriate, implement such and such, or also leaving open whether they'll be enforceable by stating that guidelines and or regulations will be implemented. And finally, several timelines for these items are listed as unknown or uncertain. So this isn't really a template for implementing the recovery strategy. And so some problems evident here are, again, the delay and the fact that formal implementation, so finally producing this action plan, doesn't necessarily translate into protection on the ground when the actions identified are not so much actions as plans for future research. And this isn't to undermine the importance of research, which of course is crucial, but endangered species have reached a point where they need action as well as further research. And third example, something that I'm sure no one in the room has ever heard of, definitely isn't in the news at all, no one has an opinion, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. So as you are probably aware, this is a project that would triple the capacity of the existing Trans Mountain pipeline from Alberta to Burnaby on the west coast. The project would also increase oil tanker traffic departing from the marine terminal in Burnaby by about 7 times, so going to about 1 oil tanker per day. And the shipping route for these tankers goes directly through the southern resident killer whale's critical habitat in the Salish Sea. So the National Energy Board concluded after its environmental assessment in its report that shipping would have a significant adverse effect on the southern resident killer whales, and it made a few relevant factual findings. One is that the ships would contribute to cumulative effects that are already jeopardizing the survival and the recovery of the species. Another is that vessel noise threatens the acoustic integrity of critical habitat. Another is that while the probability of an oil spill from a tanker is low, the impact is potentially catastrophic, and there they adopted language from the recovery strategy that says the same thing. And finally, that project-related death of even one individual could jeopardize the recovery of the whole population. So despite this, the National Energy Board found that the project was in the public interest and recommended in favor, notably with no conditions to mitigate these effects on the southern resident killer whales. And Cabinet then approved the project, again with no conditions to mitigate the effects on the whales. So 2 of my clients brought applications for judicial review of the board's report and Cabinet's approval, alleging failure to comply with 2 provisions of the Species at Risk Act, sections 77 and 79. And so as a reminder, the purpose of the act as a whole is to prevent extinction and provide for recovery. And so in support of that purpose, Section 77 applies to a person authorized under another act of parliament to authorize an activity that may result in the destruction of any part of critical habitat. And so that person, before issuing such an authorization, has to be of the opinion that all feasible measures will be taken to minimize the impact. So under that provision, my clients argued that a cabinet was obligated to do this and that it failed to, just on the face of the decision, which didn't address this, and on the basis that there simply is a lack of measures, so they couldn't possibly have determined that all feasible measures would be taken. And on the second provision, Section 79 is triggered by the Environmental Assessment Act, and so it's triggered either when a designated project as defined under that act is subject to environmental assessment, or when a project as defined under Section 66 of the act is subject to a Section 67 determination, so a different category of project. And in that situation, the person conducting the environmental assessment has to identify the adverse effects on the species and ensure that measures are taken to lessen or avoid those effects. And so again, my clients argued that that provision was not followed. The board had taken the position that this particular provision didn't apply because shipping was not part of the project as defined under the act. Our position was that it was captured by the language of incidental, that shipping was at the least incidental to the project proper, the pipeline and marine terminal. So that was heard by the Federal Court of Appeal in the fall, and we are still waiting for a decision expected perhaps later this spring. So in my view, this illustrates a couple of problems with implementation of the act. One being that whether this interpretation was a narrow but lawful interpretation of the Species at Risk Act, or whether it was an unlawfully narrow interpretation of the act, it defeats the purposes of these provisions and of the Species at Risk Act as a whole for these new effects on the species and their critical habitat to go ahead unaddressed. Another issue is that the critical habitat protection order in and of itself does not protect habitat if activities that may destroy critical habitat can proceed unabated. So again, an example of formal implementation in the form of the critical habitat protection order, not translating into on-the-ground protection in the form of measures to mitigate the effects of this project on the species. And last example, something that I've been working on a lot in the recent past, is the fact that some of my clients have now requested an emergency order for this species. So as I mentioned before, this is a small population. There are only 76 southern resident killer whales, and the current trend is a decline. They haven't produced any new calves since 2015, and as an example, between the National Energy Board hearing when we provided evidence and the Federal Court of Appeal hearing, in the fall, their population went from 81 or 82 to just 76. So the last few years in particular have been characterized by a pretty alarming decline in this species. Individual whales are showing signs of malnutrition. 69% of their pregnancies are failing, and unusually, we're seeing some reproductive aged females dying, and this is a really interesting species in that they're one of the few non-human species where females will live past their reproductive years and still have a role to play socially in terms of how the population functions, but unusually we're seeing some that are not making it to that life stage. So leading experts on this species have started calling for urgent action from the federal government, and there is a tool in the Species at Risk Act to address emergency situations. So Section 80 of SARA enables the governor and council to make an emergency order providing for protection of a listed species on the advice of the competent minister. And this is a broad power. It can authorize very generally activities that will protect the species and its critical habitat, and prohibit activities that will adversely affect the species and its critical habitat. And the minister is obligated to recommend an emergency order if he or she is of the opinion that the species faces imminent threats to its survival or recovery. This tool has only been used twice, in both cases by the Minister of the Environment for terrestrial species, the greater sage grouse and the western chorus frog. And in both cases, that was only after environmental organizations initiated litigation. So given the situation of the southern residents, 5 conservation groups that I represent recently wrote to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and the Minister of Environment to request an emergency order. And just as a side note, the Minister of the Environment gets pulled into this because a small portion of critical habitat is located in a federal park. So as the minister responsible for Parks Canada, the Minister of the Environment also is at least technically a competent minister for the whales. So my clients have requested an emergency order, and in their request, they outlined some specific measures that could be taken on an emergency basis to help the species. So that includes targeted fishery closures, which DFO has recently said that it is considering. It includes other things like a maximum speed for commercial shipping, stricter rules around whale watching, that sort of thing. So the deadline that we gave the ministers to respond was actually yesterday, and we've heard that they won't be making a recommendation at this time, but that DFO is working on measures related to the whales, and so we're looking forward to learning more about those in the near future and seeing if we think that those meet the standard of legal protection that's needed in this situation. And so again, in my view, this illustrates a challenge with implementation of SARA, which is that this shouldn't be needed. So the first question I got from a journalist about the petition for an emergency order was, why do you need to do this? I thought these whales were already protected. So this is a species that has a recovery strategy, has designated critical habitat, which, as we heard earlier this morning, is unusual. It has a critical habitat protection order. It has an action plan. The threats to it were identified a decade ago, but this species is still waiting for action, and now we're at the point of having to ask for an emergency order. And so I think that we can just draw some general conclusions about challenges in implementing SARA for aquatic species from this case study. So even for an aquatic species, which is under federal jurisdiction, so we avoid some of the complications required in collaborating with the provinces. There are more mandatory protections for species under federal jurisdiction. And even for a charismatic megafauna species that is an icon of the West Coast, plastered on all of the tourism materials, threatens to tip ferries over when captains announce that they're off the starboard side of the boat and everyone runs out to see the whales. And even for this species, the protections were given belatedly after much foot dragging and even litigation. And real protection on the ground is still lacking. So this, I think, shows that SARA is only as good as its implementation. So it shouldn't only be implemented when civil society resorts to litigation. This isn't an efficient or an effective way to protect species. Research is essential, but it can't be pursued to the exclusion of action in pursuit of like elusive certainty on every point, like what's the very, very best thing to do for the whales. We need to do something that's good in the meantime. And SARA's effectiveness is really undermined by this reluctance at every stage to implement it to the detriment of the species that it's meant to protect. So that is my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Just check if there's already a bunch of hands up. I can hold my. Yes, we'll start with you guys, and then I'll kick in after. Make sure we get the audience questions first.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Regarding the habitat, does the habitat extend into the United States jurisdiction? And if so, what are the Americans doing about it?
Interesting question. Yes. Critical habitat for this species is transboundary, and so the Canadian legal requirements end at the international boundary, and then the U.S. takes responsibility on their side. There is some interesting stuff going on in the United States at the state level right now. So Washington is looking at things like speed limits and restrictions on whale watching as well. So they're in a similarly challenging situation on both sides of the border. And yeah, it's very much up in the air what practically will be done in the near future, but similar conversations on both sides.
Somebody over here. Yeah, I'll be okay with that on mic, I think. We need it for the online ones so they can hear it.
Thank you. Do you view this as a legislation problem where SARE is inadequate, or a people problem where the politicians in positions to make decisions and push the bill forward aren't getting the job done?
I think it's a little bit of both, but mostly the latter. So SARA could be stronger, like the legislation itself is stronger in the United States, but mostly it comes down to just a lack of political will. I think like these are difficult problems. Like this is a species that lives in a well-used area. It's a species that primarily relies on a fish species that also in turn has to be protected, and salmon in BC have a lot of challenges right now as well. So it's a big, complicated problem, and I think it's the hard decisions that have to be made just aren't being made. There's a bit of avoidance and reluctance to take decisive action.
Just in follow-up to that, you've been working on this issue for a number of years. Did you actually notice much of a concrete change when we saw a change in government, or really just a change in what was maybe being said publicly?
So in terms of how that's interacted with my work on it, I guess that change happened while the Trans Mountain project was being reviewed, and so that process reached its conclusion with an approval. And I think that perhaps this government is more inclined to try to deal with that in other ways. So we saw things like the Oceans Protection Plan announced just before the project was approved. So on the one hand, there's this approval, but on the other hand, they're like throwing some money at the issue and making setting out press releases. So from an optics perspective, I see a difference. On the ground, I think it remains to be seen what is done or isn't done in the near future to do something concrete for the species, whether or not that happens.
I think you covered this in part, but just further on the Chinook salmon, because you talked about the lack of prey being the biggest risk. Is there any more that can be said on that? I mean, if the fish are, if the whales are essentially starving in a way, and it seems that Chinook salmon might be one of the answers, is there more information on that, or more action that's taken as far as ensuring that continues?
Yes, there is a ton to be said about this. Some of my clients who are fish biologists could tell you a lot more about this. I can tell you that, let's see, so with fish, it's partly a problem of availability. Chinook stocks are declining. They're in pretty bad shape. And so there needs to be work done to, I think, protect fish habitat. Like habitat is a big reason that salmon are facing so many problems, and that's a longer term solution. And in the shorter term, what we have to do is make more Chinook available for the whales. And so that's a reason for my clients proposing targeted fisheries closures. So in certain areas that are known to be key foraging areas for the whales, they're asking for like seasonal, when the whales are present, bans on salmon fishing, and DFO is even more broadly considering a ban on all finfish fishing in these areas. And so that would reduce direct competition, but it would also reduce disturbance in those areas, because part of the problem is the number of salmon, and part of the problem is the whales' ability to access them. So if they're contending with noise from ships or constantly having to get out of the way of ships, that interferes with their hunting as well.
See a hand up at the moment? Maybe just a couple of small things while we're waiting for somebody else. Oh, you got one here? Yeah, okay, go over there first. Yes. Yeah.
Sure. We see a lot of delay in SARA implementation, even though there's legislative deadlines and recovery strategy deadlines and that type of thing. Do you have any other ideas about how we can get around this other than litigating around delay all the time? So any novel ideas of how that might be resolved?
Part of the problem might just be resourcing within the relevant departments. So maybe more money and more like person hours need to be put into it so that those things can just move along. Yeah, it is a challenge. It is not super efficient to have to go to court every time there's a delay about something. Like sometimes it's necessary and it gets results, but it's really not a great way when there are so many species and so many delays. So yes, that is a perennial problem. Mm-hmm.
Yep, one here and she's just coming with the mic.
In terms of prey availability, I'm just wondering how much of an impact do you think salmon fishing outfits have on the availability of prey for whales? Is there much impact from them or not?
Numbers-wise, I would have trouble telling you. Like I've heard that 1 to 2 million Chinook are caught in this area every year, but I don't, as a comparison, know how many the whales need to eat. I just do know that given how dire things are and how few Chinook there are and how badly the whales need them, that the competition for prey is an issue as well as the disturbance from fishing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sorry, I can't be more specific without looking up numbers. Yeah, I think it's...
Yeah, we just need the microphone for the online participants can't hear you.
Yeah, I think that people other than me could answer that question. Like my client, who is a biologist, could talk about this all day long, but I personally don't know that.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking that information from studies that, if they were carried out, might provide a guideline for action, and where to go from there. At least have an idea what actions to take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's likely that information exists, but I can't say personally. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Jane, did you have one on? We'll have the question here, and then we have one online.
In terms of resourcing issues, I see that that's a huge issue. Many times, I work with West Slope cutthroat trout, which is obviously sort of the second case after the southern resident killer whales, and I'm personally seeing that, that action plan is now delayed 4 years, and, if you litigate that, are you tying up more resources for DFO to take action? If you don't, you might not get an action plan. If you do, you might not get the action plan you like you see here with the killer whales, and I see that's a huge issue. So in terms of deciding, when do you litigate, when do you not, in terms of deciding, I see that's an incredibly huge issue. But also I think DFO has issues, which I think you were sort of alluding to in terms of enforcing things. So taking bigger action and taking more bold steps means that they'd have to enforce those actions. So I wonder if you could comment on sort of that discussion, if you're having that as well.
Sure. Yeah, on the first part of what you talked about, I personally haven't been involved in a delay case, so I can't say what the considerations have been in cases where that's been done or not done. I guess it's just pretty case specific. And in terms of enforcement, that is something that we hear when we get pushback on these suggestions, when we say that there should be a minimum distance kept between boats and whales and restrictions on whale watching. A lot of the feedback we get is but how will it be enforced? Where's the enforcement capacity? So one thing that we've suggested in the petition is to prioritize funding for enforcement, because that's a huge problem. There just aren't enough boats on the water to be catching these things. It's a huge undertaking.
Jane?
I have a question from online viewers. Viewer wants he says that given that marine noise impacts to whales and other marine mammals are well established, and that shipping traffic of all sorts continues to increase, what options are experts suggesting to protect marine mammals other than shutting down shipping?
Right, so as opposed to shutting down shipping, which of course cannot be done practically speaking, some of the things that we've outlined in our petition in consultation with experts are things like a speed limit for commercial shipping in key areas in the Salish Sea. And there was a trial study done this summer by the port in Vancouver and others, a voluntary trial, but with a fairly high participation rate that showed that the decrease in speed that they used reduced the noise of the ships. So it doesn't get at the overall problem of increasing numbers of ships, but it gets at the volume of each individual ship and ways to reduce that. Another thing that we've suggested is to the extent possible, like in keeping navigational safety in mind, to displace the ships within the shipping lanes further away from the shoreline, which is where the whales would be foraging. So to try to decrease the noise by increasing the distance in that way. Other things that can be done include better technology for ships and better repair. So ships can be built quieter, and if they're maintained properly, they can be quieter. So there are things that can be done on the individual ship level. But yeah, the problem of constantly increasing shipping is a big issue, and there isn't an easy point at which to address that cumulative impact. Maybe a strategic environmental assessment under the new environmental assessment legislation, if and when that comes to pass. But yeah, it's a tricky one.
It's funny, there was some experience in the East Coast with the Atlantic right whale, which really in bad shape. There, it doesn't sound like vessel strikes are the biggest problem here. Is that right?
That's right.
The right whales are not as good at getting out of the way
No,
of the ships.
right whales are slower and less agile than a killer whale.
Yeah.
But interestingly and kind of alarmingly, in a recent DFO document, they've identified the possibility of ship strikes on killer whales as well. There was an example a couple of years ago where one appears to have died of blunt force trauma. So it's not the main issue, but it's possible.
Because there was some experience there, and a sort of a private and civil society sort of initiative that eventually was regulated, that they worked in the Bay of Fundy, which was an essential area, to try and simply shift shipping lanes to different areas where they were less of a problem, but largely around the vessel strikes. Becomes much more difficult, I gather, when you move. This sounds like you're all in internal waters, but once you move out into the exclusive economic zone, you've got to involve the International Maritime Organization potentially, depending on the type of regulations you're putting in.
Yeah, and happily for us, critical habitat is all within those internal waters, so it's a little bit less complicated.
Yeah. Over here. Yeah.
Is there any consideration for the Canada Target 1 guidelines around conserving and protecting coastal and terrestrial areas? I believe the coastal target is 10%. Does that play any part in terms of protecting whale habitat?
Yeah, so I think it was a little bit hard to hear, but sort of the idea of marine protected areas, is that so those could potentially be a really useful tool in terms of limiting boat activity or limiting fishing, but the tricky thing with marine protected areas is that there are many different levels of protection, so you might have one where fishing is still allowed or where boats can still come through, so it's potentially a great tool, but it depends on what the specifics are for each one.
So I know that there are obviously many species that are probably deserving of SAR protections, but that hasn't necessarily been done yet. And I know there's one that comes to mind for me. It's Thompson River steelhead that's been in the media a lot on the coast. Can you just speak to what sort of actions your organization is taking or is able to take with respect to species that haven't been listed under SAR yet, and how that kind of process typically unfolds and what can be done to hasten that process?
Yeah, so we haven't gotten involved in sort of like the pre-listing work. The recommendations are made by COSEWIC, and I'm forgetting off the top of my head what that acronym stands for, but the scientists who advise the federal government about which species to list. So these are all things that we're like interested in, pay close attention to, but as lawyers, we aren't weighing in on whether or not they should be listed.
You.
I'd like to go back to the very first question. You mentioned the transboundary nature of this and the fact that Washington State was doing some things. And I'd like to explore the next step from that is, and that is what is happening across the border really as between two groups, and both of which were really, really important in terms of the Great Lakes. Although the Great Lakes fall under the Boundary Waters Treaty and are within federal jurisdiction, most of the really interesting initiatives lately in the Great Lakes have come from either subnational governments, specifically the basin states and provinces, Reed, I suppose, British Columbia and Washington, and just as importantly, cross-boundary action by citizens groups or NGOs such as yours. And to what extent has that been something that you've experienced? Have you worked at all across the border with NGOs? And I'm sure they have the money and the interest in the United States to address this.
Yep. So in the past, we have intervened in American court cases about the whales. And right now, one of our clients that we're representing just by writing this letter to the ministers, so not in litigation, is the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is a really large American environmental law organization and that has a strong interest in marine protection generally and in the southern resident killer whales. And so we've been working closely with them on this, and they've had a lot of great impact or input into the petitions. Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? I think we've done quite well. Here, we got another online one? No, your own. That's
How would the implementation of an emergency order affect the decision to about the Trans Mountain pipeline not to have it go ahead and not take into consideration the whales?
Mm-hmm. So the emergency order wouldn't affect the decision or the approval or how that proceeds, except if and when it is built, any measures that applied to commercial ships would apply to those ships as well. So like speed limits and displacement within the lanes, but yeah, no direct effect on that issue. Mm-hmm.
okay. All right. Well, thank you very much to all three of our speakers, and thank you to the group and our online participants. And I think.